For me, the Focal Trio is the standout speaker of the Focal range. You may find the SM9 better. This is a slightly more recent design. I think it's really well integrated. It has the properly reference grade beryllium tweeter, ultra detailed, stands comparison with just anything, anywhere, this tweeter. Nearly touched it and got poisoned. Beautiful speaker. However, there are other ways to spend £2,500 on a monitor. The interesting story, of course, here is that this is in some ways the same speaker evolved in two different directions by two different companies. Both of these, you could argue, started life as the classic Adam S3X. When Adam went, well, let's say they went through their sticky patch 3 years ago, Klaus Heinz, who was the physicist and chief R&D guy at Adam and responsible for the design of the original S3X, left to set up his own company called Heinz Electrodynamic Design, or HEDD. Adam went through some ownership changes, emerged with new funding and a mission to reinvent significantly their range. This S-Series is the first fruitage of that new money pouring into old Adam. And this is a thoroughly rejuvenated product. The new T-Series again shows the kind of new thinking. But essentially, if you're in the market for a £2,500 monitor, if you're interested in one, why wouldn't you be interested in the other? Similarities between these two are more than superficial. They are both 3.5-way horizontally disposed studio monitors. They both feature dual 180mm bass drivers. They both have a brand new 100mm mid-range driver. They both feature slightly different but similar evolutions of the air motion transformer that was in the S3X. They're both brutes of monitors, 28 kilos. They're both really midfield more than near field. Identical SPL output of 126 dB per pair. They both primarily use PWM switch mode amplifiers. These have a lot of power. The HEDD Type 30 uses 4 300 watt PWM amplifiers, so that's 1.2 kilowatts of amplification per channel. The Adam goes even further. This beast uses 1350 watts per channel. Slightly lower quoted bass response, maybe because these are using dual 500 watt PWM amplifiers for bass, crossing over at 250 Hertz. The HEDD uses two 300 watt. That's rated to 32 Hertz, whereas the Adam, they say, goes down to 30 Hertz plus or minus 3 dB. Both very powerful. The price, $2,500 for the Adam, $2,599 for the HEDD. They're both very black. They both have front pointing slot ports. Both have pleasingly rounded corners. So let's look at how they differ. Almost everybody who's heard these side by side has felt that the HEDD tweeter is better. Both of them are rated to kind of way supersonic 40 to 50 kilohertz range. And although they are using very similar technology, the HEDD just does not sound like a ribbon. If you've heard ribbons and gone, I don't like ribbons, these aren't ribbons, these are air motion transformers, but they sound nothing like anything else. They are just absolutely transparent and incredibly detailed. And I think a bit like the Focal Trio, the standout driver is definitely that tweeter. If you want to hear reverb tails, room acoustics, all that fine-grained treble, this is pretty peerless. And what's even more impressive is that tweeter comes in the Type 7s and Type 20s, which are much cheaper than they have any right to be. Having said that, it would be wrong to dismiss the new S-Art tweeter in the new S-Series monitors, because it's a significant step up. Adam has polished out the grit from the old S-Series and A-Series. Certainly this is a much more refined sounding proposition. In any other context it would be unimpeachable. It's a cracking tweeter, it's very detailed. It's slightly brighter than the HEDD, which is a little bit nicer to listen to for extended periods. Both really good, but definitely the HEDD is the star. If we look at the mid-range driver, however, Adam's new driver in this thing is sensational. It's so much better than any other mid-range driver they've produced. It reminds me quite a lot of the top-end ATC drivers, and I don't think it gives away anything in that comparison. This is a properly reference-grade mid-range driver. Again, there's nothing wrong with the HEDD's mid-range. It's very clean, very open, very transparent, but it doesn't quite have the clarity and effortlessness and responsiveness of the driver in this. Again, maybe it helps that it's backed up with a bit more power. Bass response on both is fantastic, hard to separate. It's not identical, but it would be unfair to really say that one is better than the other. It's still better to run these with subwoofers because it's nice to unload those and let those have their run at the dynamic range available, unloaded from the job of producing frequencies below 80. But nobody is going to find these bass shy. They're both killers with all that power available. In terms of form factor, Adam has come a long way with the cabinet design of this compared to the old S series. This is a heavier, more rigid, prettier, frankly, cabinet. If we're trying to score points one against the other for which is the better looking, I think the Adam is nicer to look at. It's not a big factor, but if you're stuck on the bridge with it all day, this is a little bit easier on the eye. The head, though, is really slinky. It has this rubberized finish that you may have read about elsewhere. It's really good for attracting fingerprints, but it does have a really distinctive quality about it that's very appealing. It feels nice in the hand, it looks good. What is impressive about both of these front-mounted ports is they've managed to dial out a lot of the artifacts, chuffing. They're very sophisticated designs and they let them go a lot lower than they should do. However, under the skin, these are fundamentally different creatures. The head is a relatively old school analog design. Analog crossovers, you have some token DSP, EQ on the back, much as you do with the Trio. Whereas the beating heart of the Adam S series is a purely digital processing engine. HEDD have addressed the issue of building studio monitors for a digital environment by incorporating an expansion slot on the back that you can insert HEDD bridge cards into that give you Dante, AS, Ravenna, USB, Bluetooth input functionality. However, the Adam is, as we said, a fundamentally digital animal. And that means that whenever you feed it an analog signal, you're doing a necessary ADDA flip-flop. The upside of that, however, is that any room correction, DSP, EQ that you do is entirely lossless because it's baked into the design of the crossover. Software for handling that is really sophisticated. You have a 6-band parametric EQ with volume control. You can set each one independently, which is more useful than you might imagine. It's very rare that you have a studio where you actually want, plus or minus 2 dB, the same from either speaker. So it's very useful to be able to dial these in individually and leave them set that way and have that functionality inbuilt. You can store different EQ profiles. The only one really worth bothering with is flat. All the other ones just are different flavors of wrong. However, set flat, these are very neutral. And again, they don't have quite so much of what has dismissively been called the Adam sound. If you haven't liked the sound of Adam speakers before, you'll be impressed by how neutral and faithful these are relative to it. They have a setting that lets you go back to the original Adam sound, which I can't imagine being very popular because they're just so much more neutral when you don't use that. However, one thing that we have determined through a lot of listening of these is that they very strongly prefer being given a digital input, which is understandable because you're bypassing an extra AD stage. If you give both of these, a balanced XLR signal from an interface, it would be easy to come away with the impression that the head is better than the Adam. However, if you feed this digital, it leaps up to such an extent that it's almost a different speaker. So if you're probably, I don't want to do that, but I have to. It's really tough to come to a definitive conclusion about which of these two is better. In auditions where we've been able to compare with customers one against the other, there hasn't been a clear consensus. Some have preferred the voicing of the Adam, some have preferred the voicing of the heads. You're welcome to come and listen because it's a really interesting exercise to compare. I think that the Type 30s are nicer to listen to. They also have the ability to vanish These are faithful. These will translate because they have very little of their own character. The Adams are a little bit more like Genelecs in that they have a tone of voice that you can identify. They always sound, not as much as Genelecs, but they have a tone of voice where you recognise them as Adams. But they are very, very revealing, at least as informative about what's on a recording as the heads, but they are a little bit brighter, and you're going to have a preference for, I think, probably either the mid-range of the Adam or the treble of the heads. You'd have to make that judgment on the basis of some extended auditioning. Digital functionality of the S3H is a bit of a game changer. Feed them AES, they're going to be really special. I think the big step change in this generation of monitors is that these are just much more refined. The distortion that was present in the old Adam S series, that's been dialed out. These are monitors that you could take home and listen to all day because they're that grown up. The accusation has always been with studio monitors in a domestic environment that they're just a bit shrill, a bit soulless, they have too much of a tone of voice. Both of these are, in the very best sense, high fidelity, and they are clearly a step change up from monitor designs of 2-3 years ago. So that's exciting.